final confrontation had finally arrived as the hero and his filthy, worthless companions stormed the Demon King's throne room to announce the end of his big black dark reign. Among the warriors stood a diverse group of pathetic losers, including a useless priest, a brain-dead knight, and a magician, all led by a hero who seemed ready for the battle of a lifetime despite being a dog. The Demon King remained remarkably calm in his seat and even complimented the group on their impressive courage while silently mocking how pathetic they looked. He decided to offer a classic villainous proposal, suggesting that if any one of them joined his side, he would grant them exactly half of the world. To the utter shock of the entire room, the sage named Kaldrak found this offer far too tempting to pass up. Before anyone could react, he cast a powerful binding spell on his own teammates, causing them to drop their weapons and fall to the floor in total confusion. Kaldrak seemed incredibly pleased with his decision and immediately declared his new loyalty to the Demon King with more enthusiasm than anyone expected. Even the Demon King himself was left scratching his head, wondering how a legendary hero's companion could be so eager to switch sides. Kaldrak was so serious about the offer that he produced a formal soul contract and insisted that the Demon King sign it immediately. He argued that a mere verbal promise was a bit risky for his first time betraying humanity. When the Demon King hesitated, Kaldrak used a bit of guilt-tripping and reverse psychology, questioning if a legendary ruler would really go back on his word. Feeling a bit pressured by the sheer intensity of the magician, the Demon King eventually signed the paper and ordered the remaining warriors to be hauled off to the dungeon. As they sat in the quiet throne room, the Demon King finally asked the question on everyone's mind regarding why a proud warrior would betray his world so easily. Kaldrak's mind drifted back to a year ago, when the party was still full of righteous pride and genuine friendship. Back then, the hero was a young and pure-hearted leader who treated Kaldrak with a great deal of respect. However, their dynamic shifted permanently after a terrifying encounter with one of the Demon King's generals. The hero was left deeply traumatized by the experience and nearly quit the quest altogether. The female knight, who had a long-standing crush on the hero, stepped in to offer her full support and comfort during his recovery. What started as emotional healing soon transformed into an incredibly intense and public gym gesture. The hero and the knight began dedicating all their time to each other, often retreating to private quarters for very long and very noisy celebrations of their gym session. While the couple was busy enjoying their newfound passion, the rest of the party was left to deal with the consequences. Kaldrak and his other colleagues spent their evening sitting at the dinner table in awkward silence, forced to listen to the constant and unmistakable sounds of the hero and the knight through the thin walls. It became clear that while the hero had certainly overcome his trauma, he had done so in a way that made life miserable for everyone else in the party. After an entire year of being a reluctant audience to his friends' gymming, Kaldrak realized that joining the Demon King was the only way to finally get some peace and quiet. The hero's recovery soon took a turn for the crowd as more members of the party decided to join in on the constant gym session. It seemed the group's focus had shifted entirely from saving the world to their own tangled personal gym sessions, which left Kaldrak as a frustrated outsider. This situation was becoming more than just socially awkward because it started affecting their combat efficiency in a very expensive way. The priest found that her magical healing powers were dwindling rapidly as her lifestyle no longer met her divine requirements. This meant the party had to spend twice as much on medical potions to make up for the lack of actual magic. Naturally, this entire financial burden was pushed onto Kaldrak, who was forced to spend his own hard-earned savings to keep the team functional. The others were far too distracted to contribute a single coin to their own survival. When he finally expressed his frustration about the situation, the group did not apologize, but instead labeled him as narrow-minded and selfish. They began treating him like a lowly servant and sent him off on pointless errands just so they would not have to deal with his common sense. It reached a point where it was clear they were simply trying to find an excuse to kick him out of the party altogether. Back in the throne room, Kaldrak felt a strange sense of peace while looking at the Demon King. He realized that his decision was not just a betrayal but a liberation from a very toxic work environment. He felt exactly like a weary employee finally walking away from a terrible boss to follow his own dreams and self-interests. Still, he could not help but wonder what the Demon King had planned for his former colleagues. The Demon King explained that he intended to follow the standard protocol for captured heroes, which involved an end followed by a very public display to discourage any future uprisings from humanity. Kaldrak listened calmly and then made a surprising request for the Demon King to keep the warriors alive instead. This did not sit well with the Demon King at all, and he slammed his fist down in a sudden display of authority. He demanded to know why he should show even a shred of mercy to a group of assassins who had tried to kill him. He could not wrap his head around why he should spare the lives of people who had traveled across the world specifically to end his reign forever. Kaldrak explained to the Demon King that his request to spare the heroes was not born from sentimentality or leftover affection. He revealed a crucial bit of divine lore involving the fact that only one oracle of the goddess can exist in the world at any given time. If the current hero were to be ended, a brand new champion would simply be summoned to take his place and continue the quest to defeat the Demon King. By keeping the captured hero alive and imprisoned, they effectively blocked the goddess from sending a replacement who might actually be competent at his job. The Demon King considered this logic and initially suggested a compromise where they could end all the companions while only keeping the main hero as a permanent prisoner. Kaldrak countered this idea with an even more calculated and sinister plan. He argued that they needed to spare the companions as well because providing the hero with a sense of hope and a reason to keep breathing was essential for long-term containment. By keeping his partners nearby but in captivity, they could ensure the hero remained in a perpetual state of barely hanging on for years to come. The Demon King was genuinely taken aback by the depth of this cruelty and felt quite relieved that such a devious mind was now working for him instead of against him. The following day marked the official beginning of Kaldrak's new career under his new management. He was instructed to keep his face concealed behind his hood for the time being to avoid any immediate chaos or confusion within the castle ranks. He was also provided with a personal assistant named Camilla, who took him on a tour of the grounds to help him get settled. They eventually arrived at the training arena where a group of Death Knights was engaged in a fight that one of them actually lost its head in the process. Kaldrak watched in utter disbelief as the head knight simply continued on as if nothing had happened. Camilla calmly explained that such occurrences were perfectly normal since Death Knights have a very different relationship with mortality than humans do. While Kaldrak was trying to process the violent training session, a new figure in dark armor caught sight of him and loudly demanded that he approach the group. This warrior seemed highly irritated by the presence of a mysterious stranger in a green cape and ordered Kaldrak to reveal his face at once. When he finally lowered his hood, the surrounding crowd was shocked to recognize the famous magician who had so recently been a celebrated hero. The warrior, who was actually the Demon King's high-ranking daughter, acknowledged his reputation and seemed very interested in his sudden change of heart. She immediately challenged him to a friendly sparring match, leaving Kaldrak to worry that his own head would end up rolling across the arena floor just like the knight he had seen earlier. Kaldrak looked down at the arena floor and felt a sudden wave of anxiety as he realized he was about to face a very eager opponent. He couldn't help but worry if this sparring session would involve the same level of real swords and dangerous swinging he had seen earlier. His opponent laughed off the concern and reminded him that they weren't undead knights who could simply ignore a missing head. This did little to ease his mind because he was caught in a serious dilemma. He wasn't quite sure how skilled his new boss's daughter truly was. If he played it too safe, he might end up getting seriously injured. However, if he unleashed his full potential, he might accidentally stop her life, which was definitely not a great way to make a first impression at a new job. The warrior finally introduced herself as Ozma and made it clear that she shared the same narrow-mindedness she saw in him. She felt personally insulted that a mage of his reputation would allow a fighter to get so close and accused him of not taking her seriously. She demanded that they fight as if it were the real thing and refused to listen to any further talk of going easy. Kaldrak realized that Ozma was not the type to settle for a gentle practice round. As soon as the referee signaled the start of the match, she lunged forward with a ferocity that proved she was willing to cross the line. Kaldrak saw that the situation had become dangerous and knew he had to respond with everything he had. He gripped his magical staff tightly as brilliant blue sparks of lightning began to surge through the wood and surround his hand. With a determined look, he channeled his energy and prepared for a high-speed counterattack. He moved with such explosive speed and precision that the air seemed to crackle around him, showing everyone present that even without a sword, he was a force to be reckoned with. Ozma was stunned to see Kaldrak toss his magical staff aside as if it were a useless piece of lumber during their match. To a seasoned warrior, a mage throwing away his primary tool for channeling power seemed like the height of foolishness and a guaranteed recipe for disaster. Ozma lunged forward with full confidence that her speed would be his undoing, but she quickly realized that she had drastically underestimated the man's versatility. Kaldrak did not actually need a staff to channel his abilities and began weaving a complex quadra spell using nothing but his bare hands. Before Ozma could land a single blow, Kaldrak unleashed a massive magical whirlpool that transformed the training arena into a chaotic storm of wind and energy. The sheer force of the spell created a vacuum that sucked in everything in its path, including Ozma's own sword, and left her completely defenseless. The undead knights watching from the sidelines were left scratching their helmets in confusion, while wondering if what they were witnessing was even traditional magic or perhaps some strange form of high-level martial arts. Kaldrak simply brushed off their confusion and explained that this was just the particular way he had always studied and practiced his craft. Ozma found herself pinned to the ground and trembling as she realized that her long-held beliefs about mages being weak in close quarters were nothing more than a total misunderstanding. As the dust settled and the wind died down, she began to open up about her own personal insecurities and offered a sincere apology for her earlier aggressive behavior. She confessed that her constant talk of prejudice came from a deep-seated internal complex because she had been told her whole life that she could never lead the demons simply because she was a woman. She realized that she had been projecting those frustrations onto Kaldrak by assuming he was looking down on her when he was really just trying to survive the duel. However, The serious tone of their conversation took a very awkward turn when Kaldrak realized that his powerful wind spell had left Ozma's outfit in a state of complete disrepair. He found himself momentarily speechless while staring at her, his mind wandering into a series of highly imaginative and flattering observations about her impressive physical form. He was so distracted that he even imagined her silhouette was personally introducing itself to him in the most polite and friendly way possible. Ozma eventually caught him staring with a dazed expression and felt a massive wave of embarrassment wash over her, turning her face a bright shade of red as she saw herself in a gym position. The Demon King eventually heard about the sparring match and called Kaldrak back to the throne room to ask about the encounter with his daughter. Kaldrak was visibly shaking as he explained how she had insisted on a match despite his best efforts to decline. The Demon King laughed it off and noted that his daughter was simply driven by her ambition to become the greatest demon lord possible. However, the atmosphere shifted as the ruler wondered aloud how such a skilled mage could possibly make a mistake that resulted in his daughter's outfit being shredded. Kaldrak couldn't help but feel that his new boss was judging him more for the awkward outcome than for the actual fight itself. Back in the privacy of his quarters, Kaldrak collapsed onto his bed in a fit of pure embarrassment. He replayed the entire awkward scene in his head, while letting out a string of muffled frustrations into his pillow. He genuinely wondered if his career had taken a massive step backward, and felt that the situation was far more humiliating than any battle he had ever lost. It was one thing to betray humanity, but it was quite another to be remembered as the man who accidentally caused a wardrobe malfunction for the princess during a practice round. Fortunately, he did not have much time to wallow in self-pity because the Demon King summoned him for an important new assignment. The ruler emphasized that this task required a high level of magical expertise and was vital to the operations near the Demon Island. Kaldrak accepted the mission with a renewed sense of purpose while imagining the serious deeds he might be asked to perform. He even pondered if he would be sent to eliminate a high-level target in a display of terrifying power that would make him feel like a true villain. He soon arrived at a peaceful village of beastmen where the locals were busy tending to their crops under the bright sun. The reality of his situation finally set in when he realized his tactical magical abilities were being used for agricultural management. Kaldrak unleashed a spell so powerful and wide-reaching that it looked like a catastrophic storm from a distance. Camilla watched in stunned silence as he controlled this massive force with effortless precision. However, instead of destroying an army, the swirling blades of wind perfectly separated every single grain of rice from its stalk in one clean sweep. The local farmers were absolutely delighted by the efficiency and hailed their new guest as an incredible ace who had made a week's worth of work vanish in a few seconds. After the long day of magical farming, the villagers invited him to wash off the dirt and join them for a celebratory drink. Kaldrak stood there with a single tear rolling down his face as he realized he had gone from a legendary Grand Mage to the Demon Lord's premier public support technician. He felt as though he had been transformed from a tactical weapon into a high-powered gardening tool. He eventually retreated to his temporary room and stared at the ceiling while lamenting how far he had fallen in such a short amount of time. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his spiral of regret as a hospitable fox girl entered with a tray of wine and assorted snacks. She thanked him warmly for all the help he had provided to the village and asked if there was anything else he needed to make his stay more comfortable. Kaldrak tried to maintain his professional dignity and thanked her for the lodging while she set the food down. She admitted that eating alone was quite a lonely experience and suggested that he should accompany her for the meal. Kaldrak found himself looking at his host with a bit of surprise as he realized that perhaps his new life of community service wasn't going to be entirely miserable after all. Violet was currently struggling with the weight of being alone for an entire year since her husband had been drafted into the demon army. To make matters worse, she was facing the challenge of the Beastman gym season, which left her feeling overwhelmed and unusually energetic. While she sat outside trying to catch her breath, she realized that being a high-energy woman in a town where word spreads quickly was a very difficult situation to manage. Kaldrak happened to come across her in this state and immediately wondered if she was feeling okay as he offered a hand to help her up. His simple gesture of kindness had an unexpected effect because the warmth of his touch sent a wave of energy through her. She felt a sudden rush of embarrassment as she realized how much she had missed such a simple connection over the last 12 months. Later that evening, the two sat down for a meal and some drinks, where the conversation became quite personal. Violet admitted that drinking alone was a miserable experience and noted that a woman like her was rarely left alone by men. She suggested that a stranger like him was actually the perfect company because they could share a conversation without the risk of local rumors spreading. She began to handle her wine bottle with a certain level of flair while hinting that any gym events that occurred during their time together should remain a shared secret. As the alcohol began to take effect, Violet complained about a persistent stiffness in her neck and wondered if it was caused by her own features becoming heavier. Kaldrak decided to be a helpful guest and offered to give her a massage to ease the tension, which she accepted with a great deal of enthusiasm. He soon learned that the gym season for her species was a serious event where their bodies would act up and act in a way that was impossible to ignore. The air in the small room quickly became heavy with her scent as her tail started wagging with a mind of its own. Her tail eventually brushed against him in a way that made her intentions very clear as she turned around to face him with a look of intense energy. Before he could process the sudden shift in the atmosphere, his hospitable host transformed into a predator who had finally caught her gym partner for the night. While Kaldrak settled into his new life, a young woman named Camilla was busy carrying out a very special assignment from the Demon Lord himself. Her mission was to maintain constant surveillance on the legendary trader to ensure he wasn't secretly hiding any dangerous intentions against the demon realm. She spent her evenings carefully documenting his progress, while reflecting on his reputation as a master of mass destruction magic who possessed overwhelming fighting prowess. Her goal was to uncover any hidden secrets the man might be keeping under his mysterious green cloak. The nature of her mission took a very unexpected turn during a nightly check on his quarters. Camilla was startled by some incredibly loud and energetic crashing sounds coming from inside the room, which prompted her to investigate further. She witnessed a display of gym intensity so powerful that it made the local beastmen seem gentle by comparison. Kaldrak appeared to be physically suppressing his host with an energy that was far beyond anything she had expected from a human mage. Violet seemed to be enjoying the chaotic gym session thoroughly, but the sheer scale of the encounter was almost too much for Camilla to handle. She found herself becoming increasingly flustered and overwhelmed by the scene she was observing. Eventually, she realized that she could not continue watching in her current state and decided it was best to retreat to her own room before she completely lost her composure. The following morning began with a cheerful farewell from Violet, who promised to see her guest again later that evening for another round of activities. As Kaldrak and Camilla walked along the village path, the atmosphere felt a bit more awkward than usual. Kaldrak decided to break the silence by casually mentioning the intense gym activities from the night before, using a very direct and blunt term. This caused Camilla to instantly turn a shade of red that was far too bright for someone who was supposed to be a seasoned professional. Kaldrak quickly noticed that his assistant was a terrible liar and found it suspicious that she would act so surprised by a common word. He wondered why a member of her particular species would have such an extreme reaction to the topic, since their entire reputation was built on those exact types of interactions. He had a sudden and shocking realization that Camilla might actually be a complete beginner who had never participated in those gym activities before. The idea of a gym inexperienced demon seemed like a total contradiction of nature, and he was left in a state of pure disbelief as he tried to process how such a thing could even be possible. Kaldrak found himself genuinely puzzled by the logistics of a special demon who had never participated in the gym activities her species was famous for. He wondered how she had managed to survive her entire life, since he assumed they required those specific gym interactions to stay alive. Camilla quickly cleared up the confusion by explaining that being a half-human meant she could survive perfectly well on normal food just like anyone else. This explanation did little to stop Kaldrak's curiosity, as he noted that it was his first time seeing a member of her race who lacked the natural weapons of charm and appeal. He even went as far as to say that a special demon without those qualities seemed a bit incomplete, which was a total slip of the tongue that he immediately regretted. His bluntness triggered a minor identity crisis for poor Camilla, who realized she had never actually worried about her lack of professional skills until this very moment. She stood there in a dazed silence, wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with her, since no one at the Demon Castle had ever shown a gym interest in her. Kaldrak tried to steer the conversation back to their agricultural duties, but the damage was already done, and Camilla was left questioning her own worth as a demon. By sunset, the group returned to Violet's home, where a magnificent feast was waiting for them as a reward for their hard work in the fields. Violet was especially attentive to Kaldrak and leaned in to thank him again for how satisfying his help had been the night before. She noted that she had a lot of built-up gym energy and expressed her hope that he would continue to provide that same level of service every single day during his stay. Kaldrak took the compliment with a smug smile and assured her that he was indeed very skilled at those types of intensive gym sessions. Violet even promised him a special late-night snack to keep his strength up for their upcoming round of gym activity. Camilla watched this exchange with a mix of admiration and total confusion as she praised Kaldrak for his incredible dedication to helping the village. Kaldrak realized that his assistant was being far too innocent and decided to clarify exactly what kind of help Violet was referring to. He explicitly stated that their conversation was about the high-energy gym encounter from yesterday, and that the fox woman wanted a repeat gym performance every night. Camilla was absolutely floored by this revelation and stared at him with a look of pure shock. Kaldrak could only laugh at the situation while reflecting on the fact that the famous charming instincts of a demon clearly were not something they were simply born with. Camilla eventually reached her limit and stood up from the table in a fit of overwhelmed frustration. Kaldrak was caught off guard when Camilla suddenly stood up and loomed over him with an intense energy that was completely different from her usual professional demeanor. He tried to gently explain that members of her race were typically quite expressive and forward in their conversations, and since she was so innocent, he felt the need to provide a bit more educational context on the subject. This explanation did not sit well with Camilla at all, as she started to tremble with a mix of anger and wounded pride. She insisted that her lack of experience was strictly due to an extremely heavy work schedule and not because she was incapable of attracting a gym partner. She even claimed that if she put in even a small amount of effort, she could have anyone she wanted with a single look. Kaldrak was not exactly convinced by her boast and gave her a very skeptical response that only fueled her determination to prove him wrong right then and there. Without any warning, Camilla decided to launch a direct assault on his senses by showing her gym cloth. Kaldrak was left speechless by the sheer randomness and boldness of the move, while Camilla wore a look of absolute triumph. She assumed his stunned silence was a sign that he was completely mesmerized by her natural charm and unable to even speak in her presence. Kaldrak found himself in a very awkward position where he felt more embarrassed for her lack of common sense than attracted to the display. He eventually told her that she should probably go to sleep right now before the situation became any weirder for both of them. Camilla's victory lap was short-lived as she realized that her first attempt at using her natural magic had drained all of her mana and left her feeling incredibly drowsy. After she finally left the room and retreated to the hallway, she stood there feeling a surge of regret and heat as she replayed the embarrassing moment in her head. Kaldrak was just settling into his own bed and drifting towards sleep when a soft knock at the door pulled him back to reality. To his utter surprise, Camilla returned wearing very gym clothes. She admitted that their earlier conversation had triggered a deep realization about her professional shortcomings and her identity as a demon. She made a very bold request for him to become her personal teacher so she could finally learn the ways of her people. Kaldrak was far too tired for subtle riddles and bluntly asked if being a teacher meant she wanted to gym with him, which immediately sent her back into a state of panic and defensive insults. Their chaotic tutoring session was cut short by yet another knock at the door as Violet announced her arrival for the evening. Camilla panicked at the thought of being caught in his room while wearing almost nothing and quickly scrambled to hide inside the nearby wardrobe. Violet entered the room looking even more enthusiastic than the previous night and clarified that her earlier mention of a late-night snack was actually an invitation for a much larger meal. She was determined to take the gym lead this time and warned Kaldrak that he was the one who was going to lose. As she began to prepare her clothing with a predatory smile, Kaldrak realized he was in for another very long night of gym. Meanwhile, tucked away in the dark wardrobe, Camilla realized she had the best seat in the house for her first secret lesson in the very subjects she had been so desperate to study. Kaldrak realized he had to focus all of his mental energy on neutralizing a lingering trace of demonic magic that had managed to cloud his judgment. He channeled his inner mana through his body to purify his senses and finally broke through a subtle hypnotic influence that had been affecting him. He was shocked to find himself in a confusing situation and realized he had been influenced into entering Camilla's private quarters. While he carried the unconscious woman, he couldn't help but reflect on the original reason he had abandoned the hero's party. He remembered how their leader had lost his focus entirely after becoming obsessed with gymming, which felt like a personal betrayal to the mission they had started together. Kaldrak felt that he was a much more disciplined man who would never let such distractions get the better of his common sense. The next morning arrived with the bright sun reflecting off the village houses as Kaldrak began his daily routine. He performed a special purification ritual from his home magic tower to ensure his mana was circulating perfectly and his body was free of any outside influence. The process took much longer than usual because of the chaotic events from the night before. As he sat at the breakfast table, he noticed that even his advanced magic hadn't completely removed the faint, lingering scent of Camilla's presence from his memory. He had to admit to himself that his assistant possessed a truly impressive physical form that was hard to ignore. He found himself wondering how she would have reacted if she had actually been conscious during their gym late-night encounter. His train of thought was suddenly interrupted when Camilla approached him at the table with a very polite greeting. Kaldrak was so caught off guard that he nearly choked on his drink while trying to maintain a professional appearance. He had been thinking about how messy it would be to get involved with a colleague who lacked gym experience, but Camilla seemed to have a completely different perspective on the matter. She thanked him for the excellent class they had the night before and noted that he looked very impressive during the session. She officially requested his continued guidance and promised to be a very attentive student from that point forward. Kaldrak tried to set a firm boundary by claiming that his behavior the night before was simply a matter of her not being his preferred type. This blunt remark deeply wounded Camilla's pride and caused her to erupt in a fit of defensive frustration. She insisted that she was more than capable of being charming and decided to challenge him to a 3-month bet to prove who had more self-control. She proposed an arrangement where he would provide her with an education while still respecting her personal boundaries. The rules were simple because the first person to give in to their impulses would be the loser and have to grant the winner any wish they desired. Kaldrak teased her by asking if she was already feeling scared of the challenge, which only made her more determined to win. He eventually agreed to the terms and realized that their very unconventional and gym teacher-student relationship had officially begun. The Demon King sat in his grand throne room and reflected on the strange turn of events involving the great magician named Kaldrak. While he appreciated the help, he found it nearly impossible to believe that such a high-level enemy would simply pledge his loyalty overnight without a hidden agenda. He He suspected that there was more to the story than a simple career change, and realized that trusting a dangerous man from the enemy camp was a very risky move. To solve this problem, he had come up with a plan to send the magician on a public service mission where he could be closely monitored by a loyal subordinate. He had specifically chosen Camilla for the task because her devotion was unquestionable and she would surely report any signs of a double cross. Little did the ruler know that the mission to the Beastmen village had turned into a very different kind of educational experience for his assistant. As the time for their departure arrived, the local villagers gathered to give them a warm and energetic send-off. Violet looked particularly satisfied as she watched Kaldrak prepare to leave because their evening gym sessions had been quite memorable. She felt a bit of sadness knowing he would be going back the next day, and noted that he had been a very attentive and hardworking guest. Even Camilla found herself caught up in the intensity of the situation as she reflected on the late-night activities she had witnessed. She had observed the two engage in a very gym interaction that made her question everything she thought she knew about how humans and beastmen interact. Despite the initial shock, she realized that her job satisfaction had reached an all-time high, and she found herself eagerly looking for more opportunities to learn about these special connections. The beastmen waved their hands and cheered for the magician, who had turned a month of farm work into a single afternoon of effortless magic. Kaldrak smiled and waved back while feeling a slight sense of regret for leaving such a hospitable and energetic community. He and Camilla eventually began their journey back to the Demon King's city to report on the success of their agricultural management mission. Back at the Demon Castle, Kaldrak and Camilla knelt before the throne to announce that their task was officially accomplished. The Demon Lord put on a very friendly face and laughed while suggesting that the two of them should take a well-deserved nap before their next assignment. He spoke with a warm tone about needing rest to do a good job, but Kaldrak could sense a deep layer of suspicion hiding behind every word. He realized that the ruler was still looking for a reason to doubt him, and was likely testing his patience to see if he would crack under pressure. While he was trying to look professional, Kaldrak caught a sudden movement in his peripheral vision, and noticed the Demon King exchanging a subtle look with Camilla. The secret nod between his boss and his assistant made him realize that he was still being treated like a high-risk asset who needed a constant handler. He understood that they were communicating behind his back and wondered how long this game of shadows would continue before he was finally treated as a true ally. The atmosphere became much more serious when the Demon King shifted his focus and mentioned that their next destination would be the legendary and dangerous Eastern Front. The Demon King mentioned that the next destination was the Hamburg territory, a name that sounded more like a lunch order than a battlefield. Kaldrak was visibly caught off guard by the suggestion and realized that the ruler was testing his reaction to a very specific location. It turned out this was the site of a major conflict from 5 years ago where the human and demon armies had clashed in a brutal struggle. The Demon King pointed out that a certain high-ranking magician in that area held a serious grudge and wanted nothing more than to see Kaldrak eliminated. Kaldrak knew exactly who the ruler was talking about and felt a slight chill as he thought of Dorothea. She was one of the 4 legendary heavenly kings who took the form of a young girl but possessed enough destructive power to be considered a walking catastrophe. There was a legitimate concern that if Kaldrak used his signature magic during the mission, his identity and his betrayal of humanity would be revealed to the world much too soon. The Demon King wanted to keep his new ally as a secret weapon to be played at the perfect moment. Kaldrak remained calm and explained that he had plenty of new and unrevealed spells in his repertoire that would be more than enough to hide his true face. The ruler found this answer satisfactory and decided to postpone the departure for a few days so they could prepare. Before heading off to rest, Kaldrak made a specific request to spend some time interrogating his former companions in the dungeon. He argued that one of them possessed a wealth of information about the Hamburg region that would be vital for his success. The Demon King agreed and instructed Camilla to guide him to the cells, ensuring he was still being watched every step of the way. As the two walked through the dark and quiet castle corridors at night, Kaldrak reflected on his current standing within the organization. He understood that his boss still didn't trust him and was using his assistant as a personal watchdog to monitor his every move. He realized he had to be extremely careful with how he handled the situation in the dungeon to avoid raising any more red flags. They eventually reached the gloomy underground area where the hero's party was being held in various states of restraint. The sage and the priest were struggling in their respective positions, while the air was filled with a sense of defeat and frustration. Camilla assumed her guest was there to speak with the legendary hero, but Kaldrak quickly clarified that he had zero interest in the group's leader. He viewed the hero as a man far too preoccupied with his own social life to have any useful strategic knowledge. His real target was the female knight who was currently pinned down and staring at him with pure hatred. He reminded Camilla that she was actually the eldest daughter of the Hamburg territory, making her the perfect source for local intel. Despite her aggressive threats and the awkwardness of seeing his former teammate in such a gym position, Kaldrak prepared himself to get the answers he needed for his upcoming trip to her hometown. Kaldrak and Camilla walked through the dimly lit corridors of the prison where the hero's party was being kept under lock and key. The area was being monitored by a group of imposing Death Knights who looked ready for a serious confrontation at a moment's notice. However, Kaldrak looked at the guards and felt a sudden wave of disappointment wash over him. He felt that the Demon King was lacking a bit of professional imagination when it came to his choice of dungeon staff. He noted that since they had a legendary female knight in custody, the most logical and traditional choice for a jailer would obviously be a group of orcs. He felt this was a classic rule of the trade that had been completely ignored in this specific instance. One of the knights did not take kindly to the comment and began to glow with a menacing red energy while demanding to know if Kaldrak was calling the Demon King weak. Kaldrak quickly corrected the misunderstanding and explained that his frustration was strictly about the proper professional atmosphere of a dungeon. The guard eventually decided to reveal her true face by removing her helmet and introducing herself as a female Dullahan named Banetza. She was quite proud of her first appearance in the story and expected a much better reaction. Kaldrak just stared at her with a blank expression and realized that a female knight being guarded by a female Dullahan was a combination that didn't fit any of the stories he had ever read. He let out a tired sigh and asked Banetza to fetch some quiet and well-behaved orc guards to handle the situation properly. Camilla stepped in to defend the current management by pointing out that Death Knights were much more efficient and never got tired of their work. Kaldrak just laughed and wondered if that was really the kind of logic a professional demon should be using. He turned back to Camilla and suggested that it was time to head down for a very long and very thorough session of special education. He noted that her earlier reactions proved she was still quite a beginner and needed a great deal of hands-on experience. Banetza was absolutely delighted to come along as the manager because her job satisfaction as a professional observer was already reaching its peak. They eventually stopped in front of the sage, who was currently locked in a wooden frame and struggling against her restraints. She looked quite desperate as she saw her former teammate approach and tried to use a bit of cute charm to gain his sympathy. She even went as far as to call him a protective older brother while begging him to save her from the dungeon. Kaldrak just smiled and noted that a smart woman like her should have easily predicted the fate of a captured female prisoner. He felt she was being quite naive for thinking she could avoid the consequences of her past actions just by acting sweet. The sage insisted that they should only talk after she was released because being tied up was incredibly frustrating. Kaldrak ignored the request and walked up behind her to begin a very direct interrogation that made the sage let out a sudden cry of shock. He remarked that she was always the cheeky type who enjoyed being around when someone else was getting hurt, so this was a bit of poetic justice. The sage felt that the entire situation was incredibly unfair and wondered why she was the only one being targeted when the other two members of the party were much worse. Kaldrak looked at the sage and reminded her that she had spent her time bullying a comrade who had risked his life for the party. He noted that even in her current predicament, she was still trying to save herself by selling out the rest of her teammates. He watched with a dark smile as she struggled to deny her situation and remarked that her body would soon realize the reality even if her mind refused to accept it. Banetza was so deeply invested in the spectacle that she had even put on a pair of 3D glasses to catch every detail of the drama, while Camilla stayed close by to take diligent notes on the educational process. Kaldrak decided that cowards needed to be taught a very specific kind of lesson and ordered a massive orc guard to enter the cell. The sage could only let out a cry of protest as the large guard began a very intensive and gym training session that she could no longer ignore. The group eventually moved on to the priestess, who was released from her gag only to immediately start lecturing Kaldrak about shame and divine justice. She claimed that the goddess of courage would personally punish him for his betrayal of humanity. Kaldrak felt a surge of irritation as he reminded her that the entire party had been the first to abandon their comrade just to satisfy their own personal needs. He began a direct interrogation to show her that her reactions were far more honest than her religious words. He mocked the idea of a corrupted priest and suggested that they would soon see if her next visitor was going to be a reward or a punishment. He signaled for another orc to enter the room while the priestess continued to plead for a goddess who was clearly not listening to her cries for protection. Even the legendary hero was not spared from the awkward reunion as he hung from his chains and looked at his former friend with a mix of exhaustion and hatred. He was confused about why Kaldrak was even there and began to shout insults at the man he had once led into battle. Kaldrak did not feel like engaging in a long debate and simply called for a particularly large orc named Ton to enter the cell and begin a very demanding supervision session. The sounds of the hero's struggle echoed through the dungeon as Banetza continued to enjoy her front row seat to the chaos. Camilla eventually realized that they had been lingering for quite a while and suggested that it was time to move on to their primary target. The group finally arrived at the cell of the female knight, who was already trembling with rage and shouting for Kaldrak to meet his end. She was so consistent with her threats that Camilla noted she had heard that exact line several times already. Kaldrak offered a polite apology for getting a bit too excited about the interrogation process as he prepared to face the woman who was the key to his next mission. He knew that extracting information about her hometown was not going to be easy, but he was more than ready. Kaldrak got straight to the point and told Rachel that he wanted her to write a letter to her father in the Hamburg territory. He specifically needed her to explain the existence of a secret passage leading to the Demon King's castle as part of his tactical plan. Rachel was absolutely disgusted by the request and told him exactly what she thought of a traitor who had abandoned his own kind. She shouted insults that would make a sailor blush and told him to get lost before she lost her temper even further. Kaldrak didn't seem bothered by her aggression at all and instead noticed that her eyes were wandering in a way that suggested she wasn't as focused on her anger as she claimed to be. He teased her for being so easily distracted and wondered if her supposed righteousness was just a mask for her true feelings. It turned out that Kaldrak had a very effective secret weapon standing right beside him in the form of his assistant. Because Camilla had spent so much time lately observing high-energy sessions, her natural demon abilities were working at maximum capacity. She was effectively a walking cloud of potent presence which acted like a powerful type of evil magic on anyone in the immediate area. Poor Rachel had a naturally low resistance to this kind of subtle influence, and her mental defenses began to crumble much faster than anyone expected. Her internal system showed that her mana resistance had dropped all the way to 0, which left her completely vulnerable to the heavy atmosphere in the cell. Rachel tried her best to maintain her dignity as a noblewoman, but Kaldrak pointed out that her gym reactions were telling a much more honest story than her words. He suggested that her family name didn't mean much if she was secretly enjoying the attention she was receiving in the dungeon. He began his interrogation that made her let out a series of gym sounds. He mocked the idea of her being a brave and proud knight while she was clearly struggling to keep her composure under his touch. He noted that it was a total disgrace for a warrior of her rank to be handled so easily by a man she used to look down on with such arrogance. As the session became more intense, Rachel found herself unable to hold back her responses or maintain her defiant act. Rachel was now a total mess and struggled to breathe as she realized that her body was reacting to the atmosphere in a way she could no longer hide. Kaldrak noticed that her usual arrogance had been replaced by a much more honest and gym state. He leaned in and whispered that things were about to get much more interesting as he prepared for a final and very intensive round of private PT session. Camilla watched with wide eyes as the session reached its highest energy level yet and realized that she was getting a front row seat to the most successful interrogation in history. The sun rose over the demon castle as the long night of interrogation finally came to a close. Camilla was clearly impressed by how hard the magician had worked to secure the necessary information for their next trip. She noted that he had stayed up all night and congratulated him on a job well done while holding the precious handwritten letter from the captured knight. With the first phase of the mission complete, Kaldrak suggested they take a few days to rest before heading out to the Eastern Front. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that his former teammates were finally receiving a taste of their own medicine. He remembered how they used to treat him with constant gaslighting and petty politics, looking down on him despite his power and dedication. The hero had been particularly arrogant, assuming his status gave him the right to complain about every minor inconvenience. Even the knight had once insulted his family background, dismissing him as nothing more than the son of a poor farmer. Seeing them all in their current state of misery felt like the perfect form of poetic justice. For Kaldrak, what mattered most was earning the full trust of his new employer by proving his value on the battlefield. Soon, Kaldrak and Camilla were riding through the snowy mountain passes on their way to Hamburg territory. The cold air was a sharp reminder of the danger ahead, but the magician was more concerned with maintaining his cover. He instructed Camilla that they would need to wear masks and gloves to hide their true identities from this point forward. He planned to pose as a legendary undead lich to avoid any awkward reunions with people from his past. Camilla watched as he donned a dark animal mask and felt a bit flustered by his mysterious and intense new look. Despite the change in appearance, she realized that he still carried the same confident presence that had led them this far. As they approached the fortress of Hamburg, Kaldrak's thoughts drifted to the powerful leaders of the demon army. He considered the terrifying reputation of the Demon King Nero and his legendary generals, including the lion-hearted Balter and the iron golem Nick. However, his most immediate concern was the fiery commander of the Eastern Front, Dorothea Gale. She was known as a walking disaster who held a massive personal grudge against him. He remembered their battle from 5 years ago when he had thoroughly defeated her and left her in a very messy and humiliating state. Instead of breaking her spirit, the loss had only fueled her obsession with training harder to eventually take his life. He had even gone out of his way to taunt her during their last encounter, making silly faces and mocking her for being a good-for-nothing opponent who could never catch him. He knew that their reunion was going to be anything but friendly and prepared himself for a very loud and explosive welcome. The journey led them deeper into the snowy mountains where they eventually reached the headquarters of the Eastern Front. A massive Minotaur guard greeted them at the entrance and confirmed their identities before leading them toward the command center. Kaldrak was feeling a bit nostalgic as he prepared to see Dorothea for the first time in years, wondering just how much the fiery young girl had changed since their last encounter. Upon entering the main tent, they found the legendary commander in a state of total relaxation that bordered on the unprofessional. Dorothea was lying in bed without a care in the world, slowly waking up and stretching with an indifference that caught the magician completely off guard. Kaldrak tried to maintain his composure behind his animal mask while introducing himself as Patrak, a foreign lich sent by the Demon King himself. Camilla stood by his side as his loyal assistant, but she was far more focused on her teacher's sudden and visible reaction to the commander's choice of clothing. Dorothea squinted at the newcomers with a look of deep suspicion because something about the supposed lich felt fundamentally off to her. She noted that he did not possess the usual rotten scent associated with the undead and leaned in to investigate the matter. Camilla did not make things any easier by whispering a very teasing observation about Kaldrak's obvious state of excitement. To save his cover, the magician quickly performed a subtle wind-style mouth technique to project a chilling aura of decay around himself. The trick worked perfectly, and Dorothea eventually dismissed her concerns, assuming her imagination was simply playing tricks on her after such a long sleep. The commander was not in the mood for a long briefing and ordered them to return later that afternoon so she could continue her nap in peace. The Minotaur guard escorted the pair to their temporary quarters, which turned out to be a single small red tent. He explained with a bit of embarrassment that the demon army was currently facing a severe budget crisis and did not have the funds to provide separate lodging for guests. Kaldrak was more than happy to finally collapse onto a bed and catch up on his own lost sleep after the long journey. However, Camilla was feeling incredibly energetic and decided that their shared tent was the perfect classroom for another hands-on lesson in her special private PT session. As she began her approach with a smile, Kaldrak realized that his planned nap was going to be replaced by yet another very intense round of gym. After a few long days of travel through the snowy mountains, Kaldrak was more than ready to put his feet up and relax in their shared tent. He threw off his heavy green cloak and mask while announcing his intention to take a well-deserved nap until the afternoon sun began to fade. As he settled onto the thin mattress and closed his eyes, he felt a sense of peace that was quickly interrupted by his assistant's hesitant voice. Camilla stood over him with a bright red face while struggling to find the right words for a very personal and direct observation. She eventually abandoned all of her professional reserve and asked him a blunt question regarding his sudden gym reaction to her presence. Kaldrak could only laugh at her lack of subtlety and noted that they had clearly reached a level of comfort where such secrets no longer existed between them. He felt that since they had already seen quite a lot of each other during their recent missions, there was no point in being shy about their natural acts anymore. Camilla took this realization as an invitation and reminded him of his promise to provide her with a thorough special private PT session for the next 3 months. She was suddenly filled with an incredible level of eagerness and asked if she could finally get hands-on with her training while he was in such a gym position. Kaldrak was surprised by her sudden intensity and wondered if being physically exhausted actually made her species more energetic for these types of gym activities. He realized that while he was feeling drained from the journey, Camilla was in a much more desperate state of gym longing than he originally anticipated. She reflected on her original role as a watchdog for the Demon King and admitted to herself that her mission had transformed into a genuine and burning thirst for his attention. He tried to tell her that he needed to save his energy and mana for his actual magical duties later that day, but the assistant was not interested in hearing any more excuses. She pointed out that their travel schedule had caused her educational needs to pile up into a massive burden that could no longer be ignored. Before he could protest further, she lunged toward him with a look of pure determination and made it clear that his afternoon nap was officially cancelled in favor of a very intensive and high-energy private PT lesson. Kaldrak was utterly baffled by how a woman who usually seemed so delicate could suddenly possess the strength of a seasoned wrestler. He found himself trapped in a headlock that was far more effective than any magical binding spell he had ever encountered. While he struggled to find an escape, his mind couldn't help but wander to the impressive physical build pressing against him. He realized that resisting her was becoming a hopeless endeavor, especially since his own body seemed to have its own ideas about the situation. Camilla was not about to let her favorite teacher escape so easily and playfully warned him that staying still was the only way to avoid her getting truly upset. He listened as his assistant explained that their long journey had created a massive backlog of educational needs that required immediate attention. He began to wonder if members of her race experienced a spike in their natural instincts, specifically when they were physically exhausted from travel. Even as the atmosphere in the tent became increasingly grim, a small part of his mind remained suspicious of her sudden and intense eagerness. He pondered if this entire educational session was just a clever cover story to help her carry out her surveillance mission for the Demon King. The magician felt a wave of anxiety regarding the potential dangers of becoming too close to an inexperienced coworker who clearly lacked any sense of moderation. However, his logical concerns were quickly drowned. Camilla was now fully committed to her first private PT lesson and expressed her excitement about finally getting to explore the subjects she had only read about. She noted the gym of the moment and suggested they dispense with any remaining formalities to make the process more efficient. Kaldrak was left speechless as his student took full control of the curriculum, leaving him to wonder if he was still the one in charge of her education. While the two of them were busy with their private tutoring, a very different kind of tension was brewing in the commander's tent across the camp. Dorothea Gale found herself tossing and turning in a state of restless frustration as she realized that sleep was simply not going to happen. The encounter with the mysterious Lich earlier that morning was bothering her on a level she couldn't quite explain. He felt strangely familiar in a way that left a bitter taste in her mouth and triggered a series of unpleasant memories from her past. She eventually decided that her intuition was too strong to ignore and threw her covers aside in a fit of sudden motivation. She was determined to confront the stranger and verify his identity before another hour could pass. Dorothea made her way through the quiet campsite with a look of intense focus as she arrived at the small red tent where the guests were staying. Without a second thought, she reached out and pulled the entrance flap wide open. Dorothea threw open the tent flap with the confidence of a commander who didn't believe in knocking, wondering aloud if the mysterious Lich was actually inside. She was greeted by a very frantic scene where Kaldrak and Camilla were in the middle of their most intense private PT session yet. The legendary magician nearly had a heart attack as he scrambled to grab his mask and cloak to hide his very human face from his former rival. Fortunately for him, Dorothea seemed completely unfazed by the clothing, and simply labeled Camilla as a weak non-combatant who should probably head to the medical ward. She ordered the supposed Lich to get dressed immediately because they were heading up the mountain, leaving the pair to process their narrow escape. Once the commander had left, the air in the tent remained thick with an incredibly awkward energy. Kaldrak and Camilla shared a nervous laugh about how they had almost been caught in the most literal sense possible. As he put his animal mask back on, the magician felt a strange sense of relief that the intrusion had cut their session short. He realized that although Camilla was his colleague, he still felt a lingering suspicion regarding her role as a secret watchdog for the Demon King. He understood that if he allowed himself to cross the line with her now, he would be no different from the distracted hero he had abandoned. Camilla watched him leave with a complicated expression, lying back and wondering if stopping their gym session was actually the right thing to do. The scene soon shifted to the snowy peaks of the Vulcan Mountains, where the group stood overlooking the formidable Hamburg Fortress. This massive castle was a symbol of human pride that had remained undefeated for 100 years, and it happened to be the same place Kaldrak had once risked his life to protect. Dorothea was feeling extremely skeptical about the magician's plan and warned him that his chosen methods were incredibly reckless. She noted that using ether magic was still a dangerous theory and worried that his body might actually burst from the sheer pressure of the energy. Kaldrak ignored the warning and focused his mana while expressing total confidence in his ability to create a massive ether shockwave. He was determined to show his former allies exactly how deadly he could be now that he had become their enemy. As he channeled his power, he decided to break the fortress not with a traditional siege but with a magically induced avalanche. Dorothea could only watch with a mix of concern and curiosity as the air began to crackle with an overwhelming amount of destructive potential. To prepare for the spectacle, the commander even produced a pair of sunglasses to shield her eyes from the coming glare. Kaldrak finally unleashed his ultimate creation, a concentrated magic bullet formed by the fusion of volatile ether elements. He gave the terrifying spell a surprisingly polite and small name, calling it the Little Boy. The result was a catastrophic explosion that lit up the horizon and sent a shockwave through the mountain range that dwarfed anything the demon army had ever seen. Dorothea stood there in total disbelief as she adjusted her sunglasses, realizing that her new ally was far more of a walking disaster than even she had anticipated. The scariest kind of enemy is always the one who used to be on your side because they know exactly where to hit you. Seeing a former friend turn their power against everything you once protected is a truly terrifying realization. As the massive explosion echoed through the valley, tens of thousands of tons of ice that had been building up for over 1,000 years began to roar down the mountain in a gargantuan avalanche. The sheer scale of the disaster was enough to make anyone reconsider their career choices, and even the seasoned commander and her Minotaur assistant could only stand in awe of the absolute chaos unfolding before them. Dorothea watched the destruction with a growing sense of suspicion as she realized that the mysterious Lich had used a level of magic that defied all standard theories. He had actually managed to split a magical nucleus to trigger that explosion, which meant the stranger was a 6th class mage. This was a rank so rare that only 8 people in the entire world had ever achieved it. She started connecting the dots and wondered which 6th class magician would feel such a desperate need to hide their face from her. Her mind immediately drifted toward a certain individual she absolutely despised, and she began to suspect that the man behind the mask was someone very familiar. Just as the tension reached its peak, Kaldrak's body finally decided it had seen enough for one day. He collapsed into the snow with a very undignified thud, causing the Minotaur guard to rush over in a total panic. Kaldrak felt a deep wave of embarrassment as he lay there shivering, realizing that being dragged out for a mission without getting a single minute of sleep had finally destroyed his physical limits. To protect his cover, he decided to lean into the act of being weak and made a clumsy excuse. He apologized to the commander while claiming he was only a 5th class mage who had completely exhausted his mana pool. Dorothea's intense suspicion instantly vanished and was replaced by a fit of uncontrollable laughter. She found it hilarious that a man who talked such a big game could be defeated so easily by his own spell. She mocked him for being a total beginner who couldn't even handle a single round of high-level magic without falling over. She eventually ordered her assistant to carry the exhausted magician back to the barracks like a heavy sack of potatoes. As he was being hauled away in disgrace, Kaldrak felt a surge of internal frustration while reflecting on how much stronger he would be if he hadn't spent his rest time on educational sessions. He hated having to hide his true potential and tolerate being insulted as a weakling, but he knew he had to hold it in for the sake of the mission. Dorothea watched them walk away and realized that the Lich's identity was no longer the most important thing, because the strange and powerful magic he brought to the table was a much more interesting mystery to solve. Dorothea took a moment to admire the view, noting that the human army was already at a massive disadvantage with only half the numbers of the demon forces. Now that the legendary wall had collapsed into a pile of very expensive gravel, the demon army had at least twice the advantage they started with. She couldn't help but smile as she realized that their dinner for the evening was currently waiting for them inside the fortress. The order was given, and the demon forces surged forward with an energy that suggested they were quite hungry for a win. While the battlefield erupted into chaos, Kaldrak finally began to wake up in a much quieter tent, with dark circles under his eyes that proved he had pushed himself way too far. He found Camilla hovering over him with a look of genuine concern as she checked to see if he was feeling any better. He tried to sit up and insisted that he needed to join the fight, but Camilla quickly placed a hand on his chest and reminded him that he was currently running on empty. She explained that since the fortress wall was gone, the siege had officially turned into an easy mop-up operation for the rest of the army. Back at the front lines, the beastmen were having such an easy time that the royal bodyguards were actually complaining about having nothing to do. It seemed as though the war was already won and there was no possible way for the demon army to lose this one. Dorothea was in her element as she unleashed waves of fire, proving exactly why she was considered one of the top magicians in the world. However, her victory lap was cut short when she noticed a strange shimmering in the air that didn't belong to her own spells. Suddenly, the high-energy beastmen were being taken down by invisible blades of pressurized water that cut through armor as if it were made of paper. Dorothea realized with a sudden jolt of alarm that another high-level magician had joined the party and was systematically dismantling her troops. A distinguished-looking older man stepped forward and introduced himself with a polite bow as Louis von Bettendorf, the legendary water magician. Dorothea tried to hide her frustration at the sudden arrival of her elemental opposite and joked that he was nothing more than a disgraced old man who had come all this way just to see her. Louis kept his terrifyingly calm smile as he looked at the commander and clarified his true intentions for the day. He explained that he hadn't come for a friendly conversation or to save the fortress, but had arrived specifically to stop her and put her head on a pike for everyone to see. Kaldrak finds himself caught in a very unexpected situation as he drifts through a world created entirely by his own mind. He is suddenly greeted by the sight of Camilla, who has undergone a dramatic transformation into a specialized dream walker. She is now sporting a pair of dark wings and a tail that suggests her education has taken a much more advanced turn than he originally planned. Kaldrak is visibly startled by her new appearance and tries to understand the logic behind her sudden arrival while the rest of the demon army is busy on the battlefield. It soon becomes clear that the version of Camilla standing before him is far more confident and assertive than the assistant he knows in the waking world. As he looks down and notices that he is tied, he realizes that his student has decided to take full control of the curriculum. Camilla explains that she gained these new abilities after receiving a significant amount of energy from him during their earlier gym encounters. She seems quite pleased with her new identity as a nightmare and playfully refuses to untie him despite his polite requests for a bit of breathing room. Kaldrak finds himself in a very awkward position as he realizes that being dominated by a dream woman is not exactly the restful nap he had in mind. The atmosphere in the dream becomes increasingly high energy as Camilla launches into a private PT lesson. She mocks her teacher for being a cheeky person and notes that he seems to be struggling to stay focused on the task at hand. Kaldrak wonders if there is any way to wake up and rejoin the actual battle, but he quickly realizes that he currently lacks the necessary mana to break the spell. He finds it quite ironic that he is being held captive by the very same instincts he spent so much time teaching her to manage. However, the nature of their dream-based gym session reveals a very surprising side effect that catches the magician completely off guard. He notices a bright light beginning to glow within his own body and realizes that his internal energy reserves are being replenished at an incredible rate. He understands that while the dream version of Camilla is keeping him occupied, she is actually functioning like a high-capacity magical battery. She is effectively returning all the energy she took from him earlier, leaving him feeling more powerful than he was before he collapsed in the snow. He can't help but feel a bit of amusement while reflecting on his assistant being a literal protein thief who has now become his primary source of refueling. A series of sudden and violent crashing sounds from the outside world eventually shatters the peaceful illusion of the dream. Kaldrak snaps his eyes open to find himself back in the quiet tent where the real Camilla is resting nearby in a state of total exhaustion. He realizes that her efforts to recharge his mana have left her completely drained of her own strength. As the sounds of distant explosions continue to shake the ground, he understands that the siege of the fortress is far from over. He recognizes that while he was busy with his mental gym training, Dorothea was likely facing a very serious challenge on the front lines. The battlefield at the Hamburg fortress is suddenly swallowed by a thick and heavy mist that makes it nearly impossible for anyone to see their own hands. Dorothea finds herself struggling in the white haze as she is taunted by an invisible opponent who seems to be enjoying her confusion. Louis von Bettendorf takes a moment to mock her lack of practical experience while she fruitlessly tells him to be quiet in a fit of pure frustration. She realizes with a growing sense of panic that her mana is almost completely gone and she simply cannot sustain her fiery defenses for much longer. Louis explains that engaging a water magician in such a freezing environment is a tactical disaster because the moisture in the air turns the entire snowy peak into his personal surveillance system. He calmly reveals that he can feel her every movement through the steam and is currently standing directly behind her with a very satisfied expression. Dorothea spins around with a desperate burst of fire magic and believes for a second that she has finally landed a blow. Her relief is short-lived as she realizes that she has fallen for a classic trick and only managed to shatter a decoy made of solid ice. Before she can even process the mistake, Louis reappears in her blind spot and performs a sudden binding spell that locks her wrists in a pair of heavy ice handcuffs. She collapses into the snow while realizing that she has been completely outmatched by the veteran magician's superior strategy. Even as the demon army cheers in the distance and raises their red flag over the captured fortress, the legendary commander is in no position to celebrate their success. Louis stands over his prisoner with a polite but chilling smile and offers a sarcastic congratulations on her army's victory. He notes that it is a real tragedy for such a powerful girl to waste her potential simply because she has a fiery personality that clouds her judgment. Dorothea is trembling on the cold ground and realizes that her body is finally reaching its limit as she nears the point of losing consciousness. Louis dismisses her entire career as the work of an inexperienced beginner and prepares to end her story right there on the snowy mountain. The weight of the situation finally hits Dorothea and she finds herself crying while realizing that she is not at all prepared to face her end. She is so overwhelmed by fear that she wishes for anyone to appear and rescue her from this desperate moment. Louis gathers a bright spark of magical energy in his fingertips and says a casual goodbye as he prepares to deliver the final strike. However, his victory lap is interrupted by a very calm and intentional tap on his shoulder from someone standing right behind him. Louis turns around in a state of total shock, only to find himself looking at a mysterious figure wearing a dark animal mask and a long green cloak. Kaldrak has finally entered the fray and makes it very clear that he has a very low opinion of the man who is currently bullying his new associate. Louis tries to maintain his dignity by telling the newcomer not to interrupt his work and suggests that a masked man has no business getting involved in a professional duel. The veteran water magician quickly realizes he is in over his head when the stranger begins to channel a level of lightning magic that shouldn't even be possible for someone of his rank. Louis is visibly stunned as he watches the brilliant sparks dance across the intruder's hands while acknowledging that his opponent is using spells that are far beyond the reach of a typical mage. He attempts to defend himself with a massive surge of water, but the masked man moves with the literal speed of lightning and systematically dismantles every single defense. The battle reaches its peak as the stranger demonstrates a unique combat style that blends advanced martial arts with overwhelming elemental power. Dorothea watches from the ground in a state of absolute disbelief, while recognizing the precise and refined movements of a master who is operating at a level she has never seen before. Louis tries to regain control with his most powerful water technique, but the sheer force of the counterattack creates a massive explosion that rocks the entire mountainside. When the thick smoke and snow finally begin to settle, the outcome of the confrontation is undeniably clear for everyone present. Kaldrak stands calmly over his fallen opponent, while the veteran water magician collapses in a very messy and permanent way. As the pieces of the animal mask finally shatter and fall into the blood-stained snow, Dorothea gets a clear look at the man who has just saved her life. She is left in a state of total shock while realizing that the legendary hero who rescued her is the very same person she had spent years trying to defeat. Dorothea feels her consciousness slipping away as her mana reserves hit zero, leaving her completely defenseless in the cold mountain air. As Kaldrak reaches out his hand, she tells herself that she absolutely must not fall asleep despite her body reaching its physical limit. He looks down at her with a remarkably calm expression and suggests that she should stop worrying and just close her eyes because he is there to handle the situation. Dorothea is momentarily confused about why a man who joined the enemy would go to such lengths to save her life, but she finds herself unable to resist the comfort of his presence. Kaldrak simply teases her by noting that she has been rather incompetent at her job lately, and wonders if she has even learned how to use her own magic properly. Despite the blunt insults, her heart begins to race in a way that has nothing to do with the freezing temperature. As he carries her away into the starry night, she attempts one last verbal jab by calling him a man abandoned by his mother, which ironically causes zero emotional damage since he never had one to begin with. The next morning arrives at the Hamburg fortress, but the atmosphere in the office is anything but peaceful. Dorothea has regained her strength and decided to use it to deliver a series of high-speed physical corrections to her savior. She launches a brutal headbutt and a knee to his face, while Kaldrak desperately suggests that any professional complaints regarding his behavior should be filed directly with the Demon King. It turns out her anger has nothing to do with the war and everything to do with their very first meeting in the command tent. She is absolutely mortified that he saw her in such a gym state, especially since she has never allowed a man to see her like that before. Kaldrak is genuinely surprised by this revelation, and notes that the legendary commander is actually a complete beginner in the ways of personal connections. This observation earns him a very thorough chair shot to the head that sends him crashing to the floor in a cloud of splinters. However, the narrative notes that while most relationships take a long time to develop, a single evening with the right amount of alcohol can change everything in an instant. As the sun sets and the drinks begin to flow, the tension between the two shifts from physical violence to a much more gym atmosphere. Dorothea finds herself pinned against the wall with a bright red face and a look of intense longing. She realizes that her initial anger has transformed into a different kind of energy and suggests that they should finally take their teacher-student relationship to the highest level of high-energy private PT session. The great victory at the Hamburg fortress came with a few minor loose ends as the local Margrave managed to slip away through a secret passage before he could be captured. Even though the demon army had successfully eliminated the powerful royal wizard Bettendorf, the primary leader of the territory remained at large. Despite this small oversight, the once impregnable Eastern Front was officially under new management and had been transformed into an advanced base for the Demon King's forces. Inside the quiet walls of the fortress, Dorothea sat in her new office and tried to focus on the mountain of paperwork that comes with being a conqueror. She realized that Kaldrak's decision to switch sides was currently a top military secret that had to be handled with extreme care. While she planned to claim every bit of the victory as her own personal achievement, her hands began to tremble with a mix of frustration and lingering embarrassment. She eventually reached her limit and let out a loud shout of pure annoyance while kicking her desk in a fit of rage. She struggled to process why the person who saved her life had to be that specific smug magician. The memory of his smiling face and his teasing attitude was enough to make her feel like her blood was boiling. The sudden noise from the office prompted her loyal Minotaur deputy to rush inside to check if his commander was all right. Dorothea was in no mood for pleasantries and snapped at him to simply do his job instead of worrying about her. She realized she couldn't settle her mind until she dealt with the source of her frustration and ordered the deputy to fetch the lich named Patrick immediately. As the sun set and the castle fell into a deep silence, a soft knock at the door announced the arrival of the mysterious masked guest. Dorothea sat in her chair with her arms crossed and waited for him to enter before acknowledging his presence. Kaldrak stepped into the room while wearing his bulky animal mask and asked if the commander had a specific reason for calling him at such a late hour. Dorothea looked at him with a tired expression and told him that since they were the only two people in the room, he should stop being so cheesy. She demanded that he take off the ridiculous mask and speak to her informally as if they were equals. Kaldrak let out a light laugh and complied with the request, revealing a face that still carried a faint red mark from their earlier physical disagreement. He wondered aloud why she was still acting so upset when the mission had been such a resounding success. Dorothea's temper flared up again as she shouted about how he shouldn't be playing with people's status and feelings by coming and going as he pleased. She insisted that there was no middle ground for her and claimed she was far too busy to deal with his nonsense. However, the atmosphere in the room shifted as Dorothea's anger was replaced by a heavy sense of obligation. She looked away with a bright red face and admitted that she found the idea of owing him her life to be more painful than the thought of actually dying. She was determined to clear her conscience and told him to name whatever he wanted so she could finally pay off her debt. Kaldrak smiled and noted that he was surprised by the offer, but he cautioned her that giving him a blank check for anything he desired was a very dangerous move. The magician leaned in and whispered a provocative inquiry about what she thought a man like him would actually want from her. Dorothea's heart began to race as she imagined all the gym and high-energy private PT possibilities that might be racing through his mind. She squeezed her eyes shut and prepared herself for a very intense request, only to feel a sudden and firm pressure on her face. Kaldrak had reached out and began squishing her cheeks with both hands as if she were a stubborn child. He admitted that while he had expected her to be a formidable commander, he found that she had actually become quite pretty in her own way. Dorothea stood there in a state of total shock while realizing that her pride was being systematically dismantled by a simple cheek rub. She let out a muffled sound of protest as she wondered if this was his way of mocking her authority. Kaldrak eventually let go and pointed toward the back of the room where a magnificent glass cabinet was filled with a collection of high-end bottles. He revealed that his true heart's desire was actually a taste of the Margrave's legendary private stash. Kaldrak looks at the impressive array of bottles and wonders how many years it must have taken to assemble such a massive hoard. Dorothea starts to panic and begs him to reconsider his choice since she just finished the hard work of moving everything from her tent. Kaldrak remains firm and declares that his final wish is to claim the entire collection for himself. Dorothea is absolutely stunned by his audacity and calls him a complete lunatic for prioritizing a drink over more traditional villainous rewards. Eventually, her own desire for a taste of the stash outweighs her annoyance, and she pleads for him to let her share in the bounty. The desk is soon covered in a glowing variety of spirits that look far too expensive for a normal soldier to afford. Kaldrak checks on her condition as the evening progresses and notices her face has taken on a very bright and unmistakable shade of red. Dorothea is clearly reaching her limit but insists that she has a much higher tolerance than her guest and plans to outdrink him before the night is over. Kaldrak finds her competitive nature quite charming and suggests she should slow down to avoid wasting the high-quality spirits. Dorothea becomes incredibly protective of the bottle she is holding and claims that since it was hers originally, she intends to finish the rest of it alone. The sudden movement and the weight of the alcohol cause her to lose her balance, and she tumbles backward in a very undignified way. Kaldrak rushes over to check if she has sustained any actual injuries from the fall. He finds her lying in a dazed state and realizes that she isn't just pretending to be affected by the drinks. As she begins to struggle with her outfit and mumble about the heat, Kaldrak feels a wave of pure anxiety wash over him. He reminds himself that she is a professional colleague and that he must avoid falling into the same trap as the hero who let his personal gym interests ruin the mission. He is determined to maintain his discipline and avoid any messy personal complications that might interfere with his new career. Just as he tries to make a quiet exit, Dorothea reaches out and grabs his arm with a surprising amount of strength. She pulls him and wonders aloud where he thinks he is going in the middle of their social interaction. The atmosphere becomes incredibly gym as she looks at him with a hazy expression and then initiates a gym session. The morning sun rose over the fortress, but the atmosphere inside was a bit chilly as Camilla waited for Kaldrak with a look of deep suspicion. She wondered if he had really spent the entire night sharing drinks with the commander while leaving her alone. Kaldrak entered his room and was quite surprised to see his assistant sitting on his bed in a state of high alert observation. He checked the door to make sure he hadn't accidentally entered the wrong quarters while Camilla watched him with an intense energy. Camilla was not in the mood for jokes and insisted that as a dedicated professional, her primary goal was to serve her master with absolute loyalty. She felt that being by his side at all times was a necessary part of her job description and even gripped the bedsheets to show her determination. Kaldrak decided to test her resolve by tilting her head up and reminding her that he usually had a very low tolerance for people who crossed professional boundaries. This direct approach sent a wave of panic through poor Camilla, who struggled to maintain her composure. She admitted that her earlier dream encounter had left her feeling very conflicted, and she wanted to ask for another round of his special private PT session. She was so desperate to prove her worth that she promised to do absolutely anything to reflect on her shortcomings. Kaldrak took her up on the offer and provided a very intensive session of physical training designed to lower her body's natural sensitivity. Eventually, the assistant reached her limit and fell into a deep sleep of total exhaustion. Kaldrak left her with a gentle reminder to stay focused on her homework and promised to check her progress the next time they met. He realized he couldn't let himself be dragged away by personal distractions because he still had a very important task to accomplish at the fortress. Later that night, he returned to the commander's office to find Dorothea once again sitting among her precious collection of high-end bottles. She assumed he had returned specifically for another round of drinks and reminded him that the stash was her personal property. Kaldrak tried to steer the conversation toward more serious matters by announcing that he had a very important update to share regarding their mission. However, the discussion quickly took a very different turn as the two of them ended up in another high-speed gym encounter. Kaldrak attempted to keep his focus on professional duties while pinned down, but Dorothea found it hilarious that he was trying to discuss business during their gym time. She mocked his lack of awareness and wondered if he was really that clueless about how social interactions worked. After their latest high-energy gym session, the atmosphere in the room takes a serious turn as Kaldrak announces his plan to leave the fortress the very next morning. This sudden news catches Dorothea completely off guard, and her immediate reaction is to insist on stopping him from departing so soon. Kaldrak calmly explains that staying still is essentially a death sentence for someone in his position. He reflects on the harsh reality of the contract he signed back at the Demon Capital, which specifically states that if anything happens to the Demon King or if the political structure shifts, the human traitor is the first one scheduled to be sacrificed. He understands that simply surviving isn't enough and that he must make a massive contribution to the war effort to truly earn the trust of his new employer. Since he knows the layout and the weaknesses of the human territory so well, he feels that moving to the front lines is his only real path to security. Dorothea finds herself speechless while processing the depth of his commitment and decides it is finally time to put on some clothing. As she prepares a few drinks for them, she notes that even though he is a master of his craft, magicians are not actually omnipotent beings. She points out that if a single wizard could annihilate entire armies alone, there would be no reason for monarchs to exist or for nations to bother gathering massive military forces. She wonders why a man with his level of solo potential would have ever bothered joining a hero's party in the first place. Dorothea pours the whiskey over ice and makes a much more tempting proposal by suggesting that if the current political structure is his primary concern, she has more than enough influence to back him up. She reveals that she holds a very high rank within the demon army and offers him a permanent position directly under her own command. She believes that if they join hands and work as a dedicated team, there is nothing they cannot accomplish together. Kaldrak looks at his host with a look of genuine appreciation but clarifies that his goals go far beyond mere survival. He reaches out, while agreeing that they should indeed share the outcome of the coming battles. He realizes that while his journey started as a way to escape a toxic party, it has evolved into a partnership that might actually change the course of history. The evening concludes with a final toast as the two unlikely allies share a drink while reflecting on their new arrangement. Dorothea finds herself in a state of total mental disarray as the weight of her feelings and the intensity of their social interaction begin to settle in. She admits that she is not the type of person to overwork herself and demands a compelling reason to commit her full support to his cause. Kaldrak simply smiles and reminds her that as friends they should be looking out for each other, which is a suggestion that makes her face turn even redder than the wine in her glass. He eventually uses his hands to emphasize his point and tells her that if she truly dislikes his forwardness, she is always free to avoid it. Dorothea realizes she has no intention of walking away, and everything seems to be going exactly as the magician planned. The following night marked the beginning of a much more dangerous phase of the operation, as Kaldrak successfully infiltrated the city of Hamburg. He used the cover of darkness to slip into Margrave's private study without alerting a single guard. The ruler of the territory was visibly shaken to find a mysterious hooded figure waiting for him, but his fear was quickly replaced by a desperate sense of hope. Kaldrak presented the handwritten letter from Margrave's daughter, which served as the ultimate proof of his identity and his supposed intentions. He explained to the elderly ruler that he had successfully discovered a secret passage leading directly into the Demon King's palace. He requested a small group of elite military support led by Margrave himself to carry out a surgical strike and end the Dark Reign forever. Margrave was initially skeptical about the small scale of the operation, but Kaldrak argued that a large army would be far too easy for the enemy to observe. He emphasized that this was a highly classified operation designed by the commander's own daughter, and that any leak in the plan would result in total failure. The magician even added a bit of professional pressure by suggesting that if the mission took too long, he would simply use his flight magic to move on without them. Margrave felt a heavy weight on his shoulders while considering the risk, but his desire to save his family and his people eventually won out. He agreed to meet at the east side of the castle the following morning and provide the requested warriors.